few decades ago, a Princeton senior came back to her dorm room to find her roommate holding a letter retrieved from the wastebasket. "You need to respond to this," the roommate said. "Why?" the senior replied. "It's just some junk mail from some club. They want you to pay for membership, and then they want more money for some trinket engraved with your name. What a scam." The letter was a notification of election to the Princeton chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. The recipient had, obviously, never heard of Phi Beta Kappa. Her name was Sonia Sotomayor. Even had I not been scheduled to give this talk when I read Justice Sotomayor's wonderful memoir this spring, My Beloved World, the incident she recounted would have jumped off the page to me. Sonia Sotomayor are rough contemporaries. As you just heard, I was elected to Radcliffe's Phi Beta Kappa chapter, Iota of Massachusetts, not too many years before her Princeton induction. Unlike Sonia Sotomayor, I was a daughter of the middle class with college-educated parents. I would have been amazed to learn that any of my classmates had never heard of Phi Beta Kappa, or that any who had never heard of it would nonetheless have been found eligible for election. I don't know how the new members of Phi Beta Kappa sitting here today respond to Sonia Sotomayor's story. In analyzing what I think my reaction would have been back then, I see my young self as smug and complacent. Coming upon her story a few months ago, I find myself inspired and humbled. Inspired that a determined young woman's journey took her so far, and humbled by how little I knew and how much I took for granted. Many Supreme Court justices have been members of Phi Beta Kappa, including 7 of the current 9, and the other 2 graduated from colleges that didn't have a chapter at the time of their graduation. I'll mention just one other justice, Harry Blackmun, who, as you heard, I wrote a biography of. Blackmun grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, in a family that prized education but had very limited economic means. Graduating near the top of his high school class in 1925, he expected to attend the University of Minnesota with nearly all his college-bound classmates. But in midsummer, he learned that the Harvard Club of Minnesota had selected him for his annual scholarship, a $250 yearly grant contingent on keeping his grades up, and a $100 loan to be paid back within 3 years of graduation. The scholarship covered Harvard's tuition, but provided nothing for living expenses. At age 16, Harry Blackmun arrived in Cambridge to find that due to his late enrollment, there were no freshman rooms available. With 2 other young men in the same predicament, he walked the streets looking for an affordable place to live. Knocking on doors, the 3 found a charitable old woman who let them stay the night. The place was a, quote, old dump, Harry wrote in his diary, quote, but at least it was free. The next morning, he learned that a room in a 5-man freshman suite had become available, and he took it. Harvard was a preppy, East Coast-centric place in those days, and impoverished public school boys from the Midwest were a small minority. In 4 years, Harry Blackmun could never afford to go home over the Christmas vacation, nor could he participate in much of Harvard's social life, a fact that perhaps contributed to his academic success. In addition to election to Phi Beta Kappa, he graduated summa in mathematics. Having studied recent Phi Beta Kappa orations that were delivered in this hall, I couldn't help but notice that most of them have dealt with high questions of policy rather than personality. I've chosen this departure because given the diversity as well as the brilliance of Harvard students today, I suspect I'm speaking to some number who have prevailed over challenges similar to those faced by Sonia Sotomayor and Harry Blackmun. And I suspect as well that I'm speaking to at least 1 or 2 future Supreme Court justices. At least I hope so. At the time of my own election to Phi Beta Kappa, as you heard, Radcliffe and Harvard colleges had not yet merged, and neither had Radcliffe's Iota of Massachusetts, about to celebrate its centennial next year, and Harvard's much older Alpha chapter. Our elections and celebrations were separate. This is the first time I've participated in this history-laden event in Sanders Theater. It's not, however, the first time I've spoken from this stage. I'd like to tell you about the previous time, 20 years ago this week, as a segue to the larger theme I'd like to explore with you today. 20 years ago, I was the chief marshal of the 1993 Harvard commencement, an office bestowed every year on a member of the 25th reunion class. The commencement speaker and chief honorary degree recipient that year was General Colin Powell, at the time the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In the aftermath of the Gulf War, Harvard was honoring General Powell not only for his military accomplishments, but for his great American life story. But in the interval between General Powell's selection and the approach of commencement, something had happened. The question of gays in the military had become a matter of raging political controversy, and Congress, with the support of General Powell and President Clinton, had adopted the much despised and, in retrospect, preposterous "don't ask, don't tell" policy. This policy permitted gay men and lesbians to serve only so long as they kept secret an essential part of their personal identity. Beyond regarding this policy as silly, I had not given it a lot of thought. By the time I started getting calls from classmates about after General Powell's selection had been announced, I knew some of these classmates, but not most of them. "I'm gay," these classmates told me, and they asked, "How can I possibly participate in a ceremony honoring someone who embodies a policy that withholds dignity and respect for men and women who want only to serve their country? How can I enjoy my reunion?" These calls were remarkable because I had never had a personal conversation of any kind with these callers. As I perhaps need to remind younger members of the audience, most gay people were not out to near strangers in 1993. Certainly back in our college days, a number of gay classmates were not yet out to themselves, or if they were, didn't casually share this information with others. So the calls I was getting reflected a degree of pain and urgency that I could not ignore. It just seemed unthinkable that classmates would feel excluded from their own 25th reunion, and I was certain that Harvard had not anticipated or intended anything like this result when it chose to honor Colin Powell. So I turned to my friend Margaret Marshall, who was then Harvard's general counsel. She and President Neil Rudenstine let it be known that they were sympathetic to the dismay of my classmates and of others who were expressing similar reactions. The Harvard administration opened its door to anyone who wanted to come in and talk about the situation and about what type of public display at commencement might be appropriate. The administration let it be known that a public protest at commencement would be acceptable as long as it was civil and non-disruptive. Against this background, my classmates gathered for the week-long reunion. Of course, classmates without a personal stake in the issue were generally unaware of what had been taking place. Gay members of the class engaged others in serious conversation. For many straight members of the class, it was the first time they had participated in such conversations. Don't forget that Lawrence against Texas, the Supreme Court decision that freed homosexuality from the stigma of criminalization, was still a decade in the future. One of my more pleasant duties as Chief Marshal was to select classmates to be invited to the lunch preceding the afternoon commencement exercises. I invited one of my very out classmates who arrived in his top hat and tails, festooned with banners and buttons proclaiming the gay rights cause and denouncing "don't ask, don't tell." He went up to Colin Powell, whose uniform was festooned with the general's stars and medals. What a picture this pair made. "General Powell," my classmate said, "I look forward to the day when this issue no longer divides us." It was a gutsy move. For all my classmate knew, General Powell would spurn him, cut him dead. Instead, the general embraced him with both arms and replied, "So do I, and I hope that day comes sooner rather than later." My classmate was so taken aback and touched by this response that he had tears in his eyes as he recounted it to me. Word of the encounter spread quickly among the gay community as the crowd gathered in the Tercentenary Theater that afternoon for General Powell's speech. The mood had shifted. The anxiety and incipient anger were gone. When General Powell got up to speak, some of my classmates stood in silent, dignified protest. The general acknowledged them graciously. What might have been an experience of pain and isolation became instead one of solidarity and community. All these years later, that week remains one of the most vivid experiences of my life. I saw connections being made among people who, while they had a Harvard degree in common, had been in a basic sense strangers to one another as they moved through adulthood. It seemed to me that as we stood on the cusp of middle age, Wounds that for too long had gone unacknowledged were at last being recognized and healed. At the close of that reunion week, when I was invited to the stage to say a few parting words, I said that Harvard, without the slightest intent and through an accident of history, had nonetheless managed to bring us together in a way that no one could have scripted and that no one would ever forget. We were, as always, but in a new way, in Harvard's debt. So my experience of being on this stage spans 20 years. I promised earlier that I had a bigger point to make than personal anecdote. Something else happened in 1993. In January of that year, Thurgood Marshall died. Before serving 24 years on the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall had been a major architect of the Civil Rights Revolution, the brilliant field marshal of the litigation strategy that brought about Brown against Board of Education and the end of legal segregation of the races. When Justice Marshall retired from the court in 1991, one of his former law clerks, Professor Paul Gewirtz of Yale Law School, said this to me, quote, "Now we will find out," he said, "which is the sentence and which is the parenthesis." I didn't immediately grasp what he meant. He explained. Justice William Brennan had left the court a year earlier. William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall were the last true liberals on the Supreme Court, the last who sought to harness the Constitution as an engine of social progress, and they had been playing defense for some years. With the two of them gone, the essential narrative of American history, as seen through law, would reveal itself. With the era of progress, of the expansion of rights to which Thurgood Marshall had contributed so much, come to be seen as an anomaly, a fading historic moment, or would the country and its Supreme Court somehow hold fast to the ideals that he embodied? Which was the true American story? As I've continued to chronicle and observe the Supreme Court's work over the ensuing 2 decades, Paul Gewirtz's question, the image of the sentence versus the parenthesis, has haunted me. Paul Gewirtz, father of Julian, class of 2013, I have reason to believe is in the audience today. So we could have a Woody Allen, Marshall McLuhan moment here in Sanders Theater and just ask him how he thinks this turned out. But having posed his question, I have some obligation to try to answer it myself. From the perspective of the Supreme Court, it's certainly possible to see a reversion to type. In the span of American history, the Supreme Court has been at the forefront of progressive change only rarely. It's been a follower, not a leader. Many would argue that's as it should be. It's a profound question of jurisprudence and political science. But it seems to me that it's one thing to refrain from leading and another to reach out to unravel settlements reached elsewhere in the political system, settlements by which we have agreed to live with one another in a complex and increasingly diverse society. I watch with concern as the Supreme Court stands on the verge of dismantling the Voting Rights Act and of curbing racially conscious affirmative action in university admissions. The current term is likely to see both those results as a narrow majority substitutes and imposes its own vision of the constitutional order on a country that has, with great effort and considerable pain, come to a more generous understanding. I watch with alarm as an activist court invokes its rigidly formalistic version of the First Amendment, not as a shield against government suppression of speech, but as a deregulatory sword. The sentence or the parenthesis? On the other hand, and with reference to my previous appearance on this stage, we're now living through one of the great progressive social revolutions in recent history, one that has brought marriage equality to a dozen states, starting here in Massachusetts and reaching deep into the country's heartland. While the Supreme Court may not have been a leader in the march toward gay rights, it has certainly been an enabler, if only by getting out of the way. When I stood here 20 years ago, the notion that gay men and lesbians could serve openly in the military and marry partners of their choice, or that a woman would be president of Harvard and a black man would be president of the United States, would have seemed highly aspirational but deeply fanciful. Phi Beta Kappa for 237 years, and this chapter for only 3 years short of that, has honored achievement in the liberal arts and sciences. It's now engaged at the national organizational level in what some may consider a rearguard action against the flight from the humanities that currently besets higher education, along with the pre-vocational emphasis that has emerged in many quarters to take the humanities' place. The country has never been more in need of the values that Phi Beta Kappa embodies. Founded in December 1776, its history is only a few months short of the history of the United States. That's a long and uninterrupted sentence, no parenthesis, to which the graduating students here today will make their own invaluable contributions. You've honored me by the invitation to speak to you. I honor you, I thank you, and I wish you continued success.